Need to replace a turbo on a 6.4? I'm gonna help you with that. Nuts and bolts with Tone here, guys, and welcome to my channel. Today we have a 6.4 Powerstroke that came in with an oil leak. Now this oil leak was leaking from the low pressure turbo, the high pressure turbo, where the fuel cooler and the high pressure turbo meet. So we're replacing this turbo. I'm going to show you how to do that, and in this video, I'm actually going to do it with the cab on. Normally, I either lift the cab all the way up, or I lift the cab about 4 inches in the front just to give you more room in the back. So I thought I would try it with the cab on without lifting it at all. So let's get started. So I got this 6.4 here, and I'm in here because it's leaking oil out of the turbos. It's leaking through the turbos. The whole valley is full of oil from the turbo. It's just all over everything. It was down the valve cover. This valve cover was leaking. But anyways, when I first started this job, I found silicone all inside this hose. All right, so that's all bad. And so then I knew something isn't right. And there was yellow marks on everything. Somebody had put yellow marks on all kinds of stuff here. So I just got the turbos off, and yeah, no wonder that there was a ton of oil and everything was leaking. I mean, look at that. Oh, wow. Look at that. I got to clean all this up. Yay. All right, let's go. Step one is going to be come down here and open the petcock and drain the coolant. Next up, you're going to want to go ahead and disconnect your upper radiator hose, and hopefully you don't have silicone inside the hose. We're going to come over here. We're going to disconnect both of these hoses right here. And what I do is I take this hose from the turbo actuator and I put it up on the fuel cooler so that way it doesn't leak out. You're going to take out the two 17mm banjos here and make sure that you save your washers. We're going to disconnect the batteries and take this battery box out. To get this battery box out, you're going to have to disconnect that hose right here. Then we're going to come down here. We're going to disconnect the glow plug harness. You're going to disconnect your back pressure sensor right there. The fitting down there that the back pressure tube goes to, you're going to loosen that up. It's a 16mm because we're going to have to swing that around. I'm going to be pulling the valve cover on this, so we're going to do that. You also need to disconnect your turbo actuator connector right there and unclip it from here and pull all of your harness this way. All right, next up, we got to pull the fuel cooler off. So there should be a big nut here with a big fat giant washer attached to it right here, and the two down below, but somebody's been in here. They've got regular nuts on here. So anyways, you're going to have a 10 here, a 10 back here that's holding the back pressure on, back pressure sensor on, and then two 10s down below. Touch the 3 bolts in the middle, only the 13 on the front that holds the dipstick tube. Here's what your fuel cooler looks like when it's off. Those two down there, that's where the 10s go. There's one there and one there. And you also have seals inside. Now this fuel cooler and tube assembly is how the low pressure and high pressure turbos are connected. And you also have a tube here on the front, and that is actually how the low pressure turbo connects to the high pressure turbo. Go ahead and pull that out. There's actually a seal inside that low pressure turbo also, and that's what seals this pipe. And this pipe, it comes from the low pressure turbo, and it goes around into the high pressure turbo. Now, the next step is something I used to not do. I used to just loosen up this front fuel line right there with the port on it so I could wiggle it. Well, it doesn't move a lot. Well, it's not that hard to actually remove. So I just actually remove it, and it gets out of the way of the turbo, and the turbo comes out so much easier with it out. So once you get everything exposed, you want to try to spray any sort of lubricant, penetrating oil on all those bolts in the back and let them sit. Now, I love to admit when I do something that I don't need to do and I discover it. I used to loosen up the 3 nuts on the back of the manifolds for the up pipes. And I discovered on this one here that you actually don't have to do that. The up pipes have enough room to move without disconnecting them from the exhaust manifolds. This EGR pipe right here, you're going to have to take the bolts out here. Go ahead and take this tube off right there, so it's out of the way. You're going to have to take these 2 bolts off here, the 2 bolts off up there, and then the 2 bolts where it meets the opposite side of the down pipe, because this pipe has to move over. This up pipe here for EGR has to move over to gain access to the bolts in the back for the up pipe. So you got to completely disconnect this pipe, but it's not going to come out with the cab not lifted. Next up, you're going to go over to the passenger side, and we need to get the intake air tube and the air box out. So you're going to undo the worm drive clamp there and just pop this hose off of the oil separator, or you can unbolt the oil separator. It's 4 bolts. And then you're going to pull the whole air box assembly out as one big piece with the intake air tube. Before you can get the heat shield off the turbo, we have to get this oil supply line assembly off. Now it has 2 17s up top and an 8 milli bolt down below that holds it into the oil cooler. Now these banjos for this oil cooler is different. I mean, for the oil, that's different than for the fuel cooler. So make sure you keep them separate. They are not the same bolts. So after you do that, you're going to get your heat shield off. Then you need to disconnect that clamp. This is a socket set from Snap-on that works great for charge air pipes. All different sizes. I use these all the time. Works for the exhaust down pipes, the charge air cooler. Then you're going to go down below and disconnect the 2 bolts in front of the cat. They're going to be 13s or 15s. Then the whole pipe moves off the turbo. So then you're going to take out these 2 bolts here. This is the pipe for the EGR that goes to the EGR cooler. When you take out those 2 bolts, you want to put them in here in the top of the turbo. Go ahead and thread them in. That holds the 2 turbos together because they come out as an assembly. Tighten those down, get them snug. And then right there, those 2 bolts on top, those hold the EGR cooler pipe to the turbo, to a bracket that bolts to the turbo. Now, this is a first for me. Here's a little tip. If you have to take this valve cover off on the passenger side, do it before you take your turbo off, because the EGR cooler pipe actually can come out with this valve cover off. It'll slip out the back. And here's the pipe. This pipe does not come out without lifting the cap. So there's the 2 bolts that go to the EGR cooler. There's the 2 that go to the up pipes, and those 2 go to the bracket on the turbo. We're going to have a gasket on each end and 4 bolts that are all the same. And these 2 bolts in the bracket are smaller than the rest. This bracket here, this is what the EGR pipe bolts to. This bolts to the back of the up pipe on the driver's side. The top bolt and the far left bolt go through this bracket. So don't forget to put it on when you're putting the turbo back on. Here's what it looks like pulling off the up pipes with the cab off. Now here's a socket you're going to want right here. This is a snap-on socket just for the 6.4 Powerstroke, and it is designed to get up and around to gain access behind there. And it's really hard to do it without this socket. Now here's just removing the rest of the up pipes. Now obviously the cab's off, so I'm taking these pipes all the way off. You're not going to be doing that. This is just a visual, just to show you what it looks like. So once you get those 2 bolts out, you can get this out. Another thing you can do is you can take the turbo actuator off, and then that will give you a little more room to maneuver things. So once you take the 2 bolts out of the bottom and you undo this clamp right here, this clamp has 3 sections on it. And the clamp gets stuck. So basically what you got to do is you put a screwdriver at the tip of one of these sections and you just tap it and it will pop. And you have to pop all 3 sections. This one here, only the bottom one was stuck. So I was able to just pop that with a screwdriver and got right out of the way. There's also a gasket at the back of the turbo where it hooks up to the downpipe. And all that's left is the 2 hold down bolts. Now these bolts are big, they're giant, they're 15 milli, and they're 148 foot-pounds. So we got to get those out. And then there's these 2 big anchors that anchor down both of the turbos. It spreads across from the low to the high on both bolts. And we got to get those out. Those are really big and heavy. And here's what the bolts look like right here. And here's what the anchors look like. The anchors are really heavy. You're going to need a very strong magnet to get them out. I was able to pull out from back here, and this one here I just pulled out to the front. All right, here's a cheat code. So go ahead, don't touch this clamp. Loosen up this clamp here. Take out these two 8 millis right here on this power steering reservoir. Lift the reservoir up and out because right here there's a notch that goes into the fan shroud. So lift the power steering over, and then you can pull this tube over like this and then just bungee it like this so we can get this turbo out. And you're going to need a pry bar on each side because there's a drain tube on each side of the turbo. So now that the turbo's off, we can take a look at it. This is right here we have the low side turbo and the high side turbo. Now the high side turbo is actually pretty common to fail. I actually have found this failed quite often, and a lot of times not even having any low boost codes. So now there's two pins in the pedestal that the turbo sits in. That pin right there stayed in the pedestal, obviously. The other one pulled out of the pedestal, and it made this turbo very difficult to get off. There's a little closer look at what the drain tube looks like. You know, it's not that expensive to buy a seal kit for a turbo, and you don't have to worry about this. Silicone does not work. And there's the low side drain. So after you remove the oil drain tube, we want to go ahead and get this in the pedestal really clean, and also right here, because you definitely don't want it to leak. That's why I'm in here, for oil leaks. Then what you're going to do is we're going to take the low pressure drain tube and you're going to put the tapered side down, lube it up, and push it down the hole. And before we put the turbo in, we're going to lube it up real good on top. Then we're going to prepare the high pressure turbo drain tube. So we're going to put the O-ring on each side. The bigger you can't mix them up on which one goes where. Then you're going to go ahead and make sure they're very lubed up. Then you're going to put it down in the hole right there like that. And you're going to line up this little eyelet here on that bolt. And then the end of the drain tube is just going to sit on a bolt. You might have to tap this with a hammer, but you shouldn't. It should just pop in. And then that side's going to sit there so the drain tube has something to push up against when you're putting the turbo on. So even though the drain tube is sitting in the hole nice, I'm going to take a hammer and I'm going to tap around the bottom of the drain tube on the sides just to make sure it's seated, because this will cause a severe oil leak. Next up, you're going to clean all your gasket surfaces. I had all these shoveled with rags because I was spraying everything out with air. So you're going to clean them all up with a wire brush. So when you set the turbo in, you got to have the low pressure drain here tapered side down. Got to have your drain over here. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to put something underneath the drain here and hold it up a little bit while you wiggle the turbo and get the drain to go up inside the turbo. You want to look under here with a mirror right through there and make sure you don't see any of the green O-ring that's sticking out, because if it's sticking out, then it'll leak. So you got to just look at the front and the rear to make sure no O-ring. Then from here, we can go ahead and put our clamps back in, and we're going to torque those to 148 foot-pounds. So if you don't get a turbo from Ford, it's going to come with an install kit like this. I'm not a big fan of the aftermarket kits. The bolts aren't that great. So went ahead and got the full Molly set here. There's the part number right there. So it looks the same. The parts are the same. The 6 bolts in the back of the turbo to the up pipes, don't reuse the old ones because they're hard to get to. So here's the 6 for the back of the turbo. And you'll have to reuse a couple others for the EGR pipe. It also comes with the bolts for the heat shield, all the washers for the fuel and oil lines, and your O-ring for the bottom of the oil supply tube. And then it comes with the gaskets. The 6, if you were to pull the up pipes off, you have 2 gaskets, one at the top, one at the bottom. And then this is for the EGR pipe. up at the up pipes, and then this one is down at the EGR cooler. Then it comes with, not sure if I showed this part, but if your turbos are separate, then the way you put them together is this goes inside of here like that. And then this goes in between the two. And then the low pressure turbo goes inside of here. And then you just have the 2 bolts. So it goes in, there's nothing at the bottom because you have a gasket. And then you have the 2 bolts here. So that's what those are for. So from here, once you have your turbo in, the fun begins. Taking it out is actually not the hardest part. Putting it in is the hardest part. Getting the gaskets back there. Sometimes these aftermarket turbos, they come with a gasket at the up pipes where it's one solid gasket all the way across, and it covers both up pipes. The last one I did was like that. It was great. Super easy. This one does not have that, so you'll obviously have to put your gasket in and get the top bolt in, and then come over to the side and get the side bolt in, and then obviously the bottom one, and then the same thing here, put the top bolt in and this side bolt, and then you'll have to do the bottom bolt. Don't forget, before you put your oil feed line on here, to put the heat shield on. If you get one of these aftermarket turbos, you want to set your heat shield on the turbos while it's off the car. The last one I did, they had this clamp right here in the wrong spot. So I had to notch out the heat shield to fit around it. So you want to go ahead and bolt up the passenger one completely, tighten it down. And then don't forget this bracket here. It goes in the top bolt and the driver's side most bolt, like that. So got to put that in, tighten that up, and then you got to slip if you don't have the valve cover off and you didn't take the EGR pipe out, you got to put the EGR pipe back in. Or if you just have it back there out of the way, you got to get that back in place.
And you got 2 bolts on top into the bracket here. And then you also have the 2 bolts through the up pipe. And then you have the 2 bolts that go into the EGR cooler.
All right, so before you put your heat shield on and all that, once you get all your exhaust piping connected, and you got all that done, you got to have this gasket right here, and it goes on the outlet of the turbo, and then you take this little tab and you bend it down, and it holds it on, and then we can connect this up pipe or down pipe. So if you have to replace your turbo actuator, it's no longer coolant. It no longer uses coolant anymore. So I'll be showing you in a minute. We got to redirect the coolant hose over to the fuel crossover, and there is no coolant running through this. It just bolts up to a plate, has an arm, goes right there to the turbo, and it has a connector right there. It's an upgraded design from BorgWarner. Ford does not make a new actuator anymore. Now, if you get a Molly valve cover set, it'll come with these new seals here. So I went ahead and replaced these because they were leaking. So we got new ones here. I'm going to lube those up real good and before I slide that on. So once you get it all back together, you're going to need to put a bleeding apparatus back here on the supply. So this is a fitting from the front of the head on a 6-liter. And I just drilled out the banjo. And I put this fitting on here and put it on a clear hose. So you're going to put this on the back fitting on your fuel cooler, run it into a jug, cycle the key for about 30 seconds. And with this hooked up, go ahead and start it. Let it run for 30 seconds. And then you can take it off, put your banjo back in, and everything will run fine. You're just purging all the air out of the system. Okay, so after making this video, I've decided that leaving the cab on is the easiest thing to do. Now, I will tell you that it is much more difficult getting the white pipes started in the back because you don't have a lot of room. However, I actually learned a couple little tips in this video while I was not just making this video, but on this truck. I learned that if you lift the power steering reservoir over, you don't have to take the rubber boot off of the charge air pipe. you can disconnect both ends of the charge air cooler pipe and just move it over out of the way. It's out of the way of the turbo. Over the course of doing these turbos, I've also learned that if you just take off the low pressure line that goes to the fuel cooler down by the fuel filter housing, if you just take it off completely, it's so much easier to maneuver that turbo out of there. So, thanks for watching the video. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to get notified of all my future content, which you definitely don't want to miss. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know whether you do it with the cab on or off. I'll see you guys next time.